Chapter 11 of The Door Through Space. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. That's LibriVox.org. Recording by Christy Nowak. The Door Through Space by Marion Zimmer Bradley. Chapter 11. Lights flared in my eyes. I was standing solidly on my feet in the street shrine, but the street was gone. Coils of incense still smudged the air. The god squatted, toad-like, in his recess. The girl was hanging limp, locked in my clenched arms. As the floor straightened under my feet, I staggered, thrown off balance by the sudden return of the girl's weight, and grabbed blindly for support. "Give her to me," said a voice, and the girl's sagging body was lifted from my arms. A strong hand grasped my elbow. I found a chair beneath my knees and sank gratefully into it. "The transmission isn't smooth yet between such distant terminals," the voice remarked. "I see Merlin has fainted again. A weakling, the girl, but useful." I spat blood, trying to get the room in focus, for I was inside a room of some translucent substance, windowless, a skylight high above me, through which pink daylight streamed. Daylight. And it had been midnight in Terran. I had come halfway around the planet in a few seconds. From somewhere I heard the sound of hammering, tiny, bell-like hammering, the chiming of a fairy anvil. I looked up and saw a man, watching me. On Wolf, you see all kinds of human, half-human, and non-human life, and I considered myself something of an expert on all three. But I had never seen anyone, or anything, who so closely resembled the human, and so obviously wasn't. He, or it, was tall and lean, man-shaped, but oddly muscled, a vague suggestion of something less than human in the lean hunch of his posture. Man-like, he wore green, tight-fitting trunks and a shirt of green fur that revealed bulging biceps where they shouldn't be, and angular planes where there should have been swelling muscles. The shoulders were high, the neck unpleasantly sinuous, and the face, a little narrower than human, was handsomely arrogant, with a kind of wary, alert mischief that was the least human thing about him. He bent, tilted the girl's inert body on a divan of some sort, and turned his back on her, lifting his hand in an impatient and unpleasantly reminiscent gesture. The tinkling of the little hammers stopped, as if a switch had been disconnected. "Now," said the non-human, "we can talk." Like the waif, he spoke Shainsa, and spoke it with a better accent than any non-human I'd ever known, so well that I looked again to be certain. I wasn't too dazed to answer in the same tongue, but I couldn't keep back a spate of questions. "What happened? Who are you? What is this place?" The non-human waited, crossing his hands, quite passable hands if you didn't look too closely at what should have been nails, and bent forward in a sketchy gesture. "Do not blame Merlin. She acted under orders. It was imperative you be brought here tonight, and we had reason to believe you might ignore an ordinary summons. You were clever at evading our surveillance, for a time, but there would not be two dry-towners in Terran tonight who would dare the ghost wind. Your reputation does you justice, Recall Sensar." "Recall Sensar! Once again, recall!" Shaken, I pulled a rag from my pocket and wiped blood from my mouth. I'd figured out in Shainsa why the mistake was logical, and here in Terran I'd been hanging around in Recall's old haunts, covering his old trails. Once again, mistaken identity was natural. Natural or not, I wasn't going to deny it. If these were Recall's enemies, my real identity should be kept as an ace in reserve which might, just might, get me out alive again. If they were his friends, well, I could only hope that no one who knew him well by sight would walk in on me. "We knew," the non-human continued, "that if you remained where you were, the Terran Cargill would have made his arrest. We know about your quarrel with Cargill, among other things, but we did not consider it necessary that you should fall into his hands at present." I was puzzled. "I still don't understand. Exactly where am I?" "This is the Master Shrine of Nebran." Nebran! The stray pieces of the puzzle suddenly jolted into place. Kiral had warned me, not knowing he was doing it. I hastily imitated the gesture Kiral had made, gabbling a few words of an archaic charm. Like every Earthman who's lived on Wolf more than a tourist season, I'd seen faces go blank and impassive at the mention of the Toad God. Rumor made his spies omnipresent, his priests omniscient, his anger all-powerful. I had believed about 1/10 of what I had heard, or less. The Terran Empire has little to say to planetary religions, and Nebran's cult is a remarkably obscure one, despite the street shrines on every corner. Now I was in his master shrine, and the device which had brought me here was beyond doubt a working model of a matter transmitter. A matter transmitter. A working model. The words triggered memory. Recall was after it. "And who," I asked slowly, "are you, Lord?" The green-clad creature hunched thin shoulders again in a ceremonious gesture. "I am called Everin, humble servant of Nebran and yourself," he added, but there was no humility in his manner. "I am called the Toymaker." Everin! That was another name given weight by rumor, a breath of gossip in a thieves' market, a scrawled word on smudged paper, a blank folder in Terran Intelligence. Another puzzle piece snapped into place. Toymaker. The girl on the divan sat up suddenly, passing slim hands over her disheveled hair. "Did I faint, Everin? I had to fight to get him into the stone, and the patterns were not set straight in that terminal. You must send one of the little ones to set them to rights. Toymaker, are you listening to me?" "Stop chattering, Maylin," said Everin indifferently. "You brought him here, and that is all that matters. You aren't hurt?" Maylin pouted and looked ruefully at her bare, bruised feet, patted the wrinkles of her ragged frock with fastidious fingers. "My poor feet," she mourned. "They are black and blue with the cobbles, and my hair is filled with sand and tangles. Toymaker, what way was this to send me to entice a man? Any man would have come quickly, if he had seen me looking lovely. But you send me in rags." She stamped a small bare foot. She was not nearly as young as she looked in the street. Though immature and underdeveloped by Terran standards, she had a fair figure for a Drytown woman. Her rags fell now in graceful folds. Her hair was spun black glass, and I saw what the rags and the confusion in the filthy street had kept me from seeing before. It was the girl of the Spaceport Café, the girl who had appeared and vanished in the eerie streets of Canarsa. Everin was regarding her with what, in a human, might have been rueful impatience. He said, "You know you enjoyed yourself, as always, Maylin. Run along and make yourself beautiful again, little nuisance." The girl danced out of the room, and I was just as glad to see her go. The Toymaker motioned to me. "This way," he directed, and led me through a different door. The off-stage hammering I had heard, tiny bell tones like a fairy xylophone, began again as the door opened, and we passed into a workroom which made me remember nursery tales from a half-forgotten childhood on Terra, for the workers were tiny, gnarled trolls. They were Chucks from the polar mountains, dwarfed and furred and half-human, with witch-like faces and great golden eyes, and I had the curious feeling that if I looked hard enough I would see the little toy seller they had hunted out of the Kharsa. I didn't look. I figured I was in enough trouble already. Tiny hammers pattered on miniature anvils in a tinkling, jingling chorus of musical clinks and taps. Golden eyes focused like lenses over winking jewels and gimcracks. Busy elves, makers of toys. Everin jerked his shoulders with an imperative gesture. I followed him through a fairy workroom, but could not refrain from casting a lingering look at the work tables. A withered leprechaun set eyes into the head of a mannequin hound. Furred fingers worked precious metals into invisible filigree for the collar-piece of a dancing doll. Metallic feathers were thrust with clockwork precision into the wings of a skeleton bird no longer than my fingernail. The nose of the hound wabbled and sniffed. The bird's wings quivered. The eyes of the little dancer followed my footsteps. Toys. "This way," Everin rapped, and a door slid shut behind us. The clinks and taps grew fainter, but never ceased. My face must have betrayed more than conventional impassivity, for Everin smiled. "Now you know, Rakal, why I am called the Toymaker. Is it not strange? The master priest of Nebran, a maker of toys, and the shrine of the Toad God, a workshop for children's playthings." Everin paused suggestively. They were obviously not children's playthings, and this was my cue to say so, but I avoided the trap. Everin opened a sliding panel and took out a doll. She was perhaps the length of my longest finger, molded to the precise proportions of a woman, and costumed after the bizarre fashion of the Ardkran dancing girls. Everin touched no button or key that I could see, but when he set the figure on its feet, it executed a whirling, arm-tossing dance in a fast, tricky tempo. "I am, in a sense, benevolent," Everin murmured. He snapped his fingers, and the doll sank to her knees, and poised there, silent. "Moreover, I have the means and, let us say, the ability to indulge my small fantasies. The little daughter of the president of the Federation of Trade Cities on Samara was sent such a doll recently. What a pity that Paolo Eramengo was so suddenly impeached and banished." The Toymaker clucked his teeth commiseratingly. "Perhaps this small companion will compensate the little Carmela for her adjustment to her new position." He replaced the dancer and pulled down something like a whirligig. "This might interest you," he mused, and set it spinning. I stared at the pattern of lights that flowed and disappeared, melting in and out of visible shadows. Suddenly I realized what the thing was doing. I wrested my eyes away with an effort. Had there been a lapse of seconds or minutes? Had Everin spoken? Everin arrested the compelling motion with one finger. "Several of these pretty playthings are available to the children of important men," he said absently. "An import of value for our exploited and impoverished world. Unfortunately, they are perhaps a little, obvious. The incident of nervous breakdowns is, interfering with their sale. The children, of course, are unaffected and love them." Everin set the hypnotic wheel moving again, glanced sideways at me, and set it carefully back. "Now," Everin's voice, hard with the silkiness of a cat's snarl, clawed the silence, "we'll talk business." I turned, composing my face. Everin had something concealed in one hand, but I didn't think it was a weapon, and if I'd known, I'd have had to ignore it anyway. "Perhaps you wonder how we recognized and found you?" A panel cleared in the wall and became translucent. Confused flickers moved, dropped into focus, and I realized that the panel was an ordinary television screen, and I was looking into the well-known interior of the Café of Three Rainbows in the trade city of Terran. By this time I was running low on curiosity, and didn't wonder till much, much later how televised pictures were transmitted around the curve of a planet. Everin sharpened the focus down on the long, Earth-type bar where a tall man in Terran clothes was talking to a pale-haired girl. Everin said, "By now, Race Cargill has decided, no doubt, that you fell into his trap and into the hands of the Yamen. He is off guard now." And suddenly the whole thing seemed so unbearably, illogically funny that my shoulders shook with the effort to keep back dangerous laughter. Since I'd landed in Terran, I'd taken great pains to avoid the trade city, or anyone who might have associated me with it, and Racal, somehow aware of this, had conveniently filled in the gap by posing as me. It wasn't nearly as difficult as it sounded. I had found that out in Shain-Sa. Terran is a long, long way from the major trade city near the Kharsa. I hadn't a single intimate friend there, or within hundreds of miles, to see through the imposture. At most, there were half a dozen of the staff that I'd once met or had a drink with 8 or 10 years ago. Racal could speak perfect standard when he chose. If he lapsed into Dry-Town idiom, that too was in my known character. I had no doubt he was making a great success of it all, probably doing much better with my identity than I could ever have done with his. Everin rasped. "Cargill meant to leave the planet. What stopped him? You could be of use to us, Racal, but not with this blood feud unsettled." That needed no elucidation. No wolfen in his right mind will bargain with a Dry-Towner carrying an unresolved blood feud. By law and custom, declared blood feud takes precedent over any other business, public or private, and is sufficient excuse for broken promises, neglected duties, theft, even murder. "We want it settled once and for all." Everin's voice was low and unhurried. "And we aren't above weighting the scales. This Cargill can and has posed as a Dry-Towner, undetected. We don't like Earthmen who can do that. In settling your feud, you will be aiding us and removing a danger. We would be grateful." He opened his closed hand, displaying something small, curled, inert. "Every living thing emits a characteristic pattern of electrical nerve impulses. We have ways of recording those impulses, and we have had you and Cargill under observation for a long time. We've had plenty of opportunity to key this toy to Cargill's pattern." On his palm the curled thing stirred, spread wings. A fledgling bird lay there, small soft body throbbing slightly. Half hidden in a ruff of metallic feathers I glimpsed a grimly elongated beak. The pinions were feathered with delicate down less than 1/4 of an inch long. They beat with delicate insistence against the toymaker's prisoning fingers. "This is not dangerous to you. Press here," he showed me. "And if Race Cargill is within a certain distance, and it is up to you to be within that distance, it will find him, and kill him, unerringly, inescapably, untraceably. We will not tell you the critical distance, and we will give you 3 days." He checked my startled exclamation with a gesture. "Of course, this is a test. Within the hour, Cargill will receive a warning. We want no incompetents who must be helped too much, nor do we want cowards. If you fail, or release the bird at a distance too great, or evade the test—" the green inhuman malice in his eyes made me sweat. "We have made another bird." By now my brain was swimming, but I thought I understood the complex, inhuman logic involved. "The other bird is keyed to me." With slow contempt, Everin shook his head. You are used to danger and fond of a gamble. Nothing so simple. We have given you 3 days. If within that time the bird you carried has not killed, the other bird will fly, and it will kill. Racal, you have a wife." Yes, Racal had a wife. They could threaten Racal's wife, and his wife was my sister Julie. Everything after that was anticlimax. Of course I had to drink with Averin, the elaborate formal ritual without which no bargain on wolf is concluded. He entertained me with gory and technical descriptions of the ways in which the birds, and other of his hellish toys, did their killing and worse tasks. Maylin danced into the room and upset the exquisite solemnity of the wine ritual by perching on my knee, stealing a sip from my cup, and pouting prettily when I paid her less attention than she thought she merited. I didn't dare pay much attention, even when she whispered, with the deliberate and thorough wantonness of a dry-town woman of high caste who has flung aside her fetters, something about a rendezvous at the 3 Rainbows. But eventually it was over, and I stepped through a door that twisted with a giddy blankness and found myself outside a bare, windowless wall in Terran again, the night sky starred and cold. The acrid smell of the ghost wind was thinning in the streets, but I had to crouch in a cranny of the wall when a final rustling horde of Yamen, the last of their receding tide, rustled down the street. I found my way to my lodging in a filthy chalk hostel and threw myself down on the verminous bed. Believe it or not, I slept. End of Chapter 11. 12. Of the Door Through Space. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. That's LibriVox.org. Recording by Christy Nowak. The Door Through Space by Marion Zimmer Bradley. Chapter 12. An hour before dawn there was a noise in my room. I roused, my hand on my skein. Someone, or something, was fumbling under the mattress where I had thrust Everin's bird. I struck out, encountered something warm and breathing, and grappled with it in the darkness. A foul-smelling something gripped over my mouth. I tore it away and struck hard with the skein. There was a high shrilling. The gripping filth loosened and fell away, and something died on the floor. I struck a light, retching in revulsion. It hadn't been human. There wouldn't have been that much blood from a human. Not that color, either. The Chalk who ran the place came and gibbered at me. Chalks have a horror of blood, and this one gave me to understand that my lease was up then and there. No arguments, no refunds. He wouldn't even let me go into his stone outbuilding to wash the foul stuff from my shirt-cloak. I gave up and fished under the mattress for Everin's toy. The Chalk got a glimpse of the embroideries on the silk in which it was wrapped and stood back, his loose, furry lips hanging open, while I gathered my few belongings together and strode out of the room. He would not touch the coins I offered. I laid them on a chest, and he let them lie there, and as I went into the reddening morning, they came flying after me into the street. I pulled the silk from the toy and tried to make some sense from my predicament. The little thing lay innocent and silent in my palm. It wouldn't tell me whether it had been keyed to me, the real Cargill, some time in the past, or to Racal, using my name and reputation in the Terran colony here at Terran. If I pressed the stud, it might play out this comedy of errors by hunting down Racal, and all my troubles would be over. For a while, at least, until Everin found out what had happened. I didn't deceive myself that I could carry the impersonation through another meeting. On the other hand, if I pressed the stud, the bird might turn on me, and then all my troubles would be over for good. If I delayed past Everin's deadline and did nothing, the other bird in his keeping would hunt down Julie and give her a swift and not too painless death. I spent most of the day in a chalk dive, juggling plans, toys innocent and sinister, spies, messengers, toys which killed horribly, toys which could be controlled perhaps by the pliant mind of a child, And every child hates its parents now and again. Even in the Terran colony, who was safe? In Mac's very home, one of the Magnuson youngsters had a shiny thing which might or might not be one of Everin's hellish toys. Or was I beginning to think like a superstitious dry-towner? Damn it, Everin couldn't be infallible. He hadn't even recognized me as Race Cargill. Or... Suddenly the sweat broke out again on my forehead. Or had he? Had the whole thing been one of those sinister, deadly, and incomprehensible non-human jokes? I kept coming to the same conclusion. Julie was in danger, but she was half a world away. Racal was here in Terran. There was a child involved. Julie's child. The first step was to get inside the Terran colony and see how the land lay. Terran is a city shaped like a crescent moon encircling the small trade city. A miniature spaceport, a miniature skyscraper HQ, and clustered dwellings of the Terrans who worked there, and those who lived with them and supplied them with necessities, services, and luxuries. Entry from one to the other is through a guarded gateway, since this is hostile territory, and Terran lies far beyond the impress of ordinary Terran law. But the gate stood open wide, and the guards looked lax and bored. They had shockers, but they didn't look as if they'd used them lately. One raised an eyebrow to his companion as I shambled up. I could pretty well guess the impression I made, dirty, unkempt, and stained with non-human blood. I asked permission to go into the Terran zone. They asked me my name and business, and I toyed with the notion of giving them the name of the man I was inadvertently impersonating. Then I decided that if Racal had passed himself off as Race Cargill, he'd expect exactly that, and he was also capable of the masterstroke of impudence, putting out a pickup order through Space Force for his own name. So I gave them the name we'd used from Shainsaw to Charon, and tacked one of the Secret Service passwords on the end of it. They each looked at each other again, and one said, "Raskar, eh? This is the guy, all right." He took me into the little booth by the gate while the other used an intercom device. Presently they took me along to the HQ building and into an office that said Legate. I tried not to panic, but it wasn't easy. Evidently I'd walked square into another trap. One guard asked me, "All right, now, what exactly is your business in the trade city?" I'd hoped to locate Racal first. Now I knew I'd have no chance, and at all costs I must straighten out this matter of identity before it went any further. "Put me straight through to Magnuson's office, level 38 at Central HQ, by Vizzy," I demanded. I was trying to remember if Mac had ever even heard the name we used in Shainsaw. I decided I couldn't risk it. "Name of Race Cargill." The guard grinned without moving. He said to his partner, "That's the one, all right." He put his hand on my shoulder, spinning me around. "Haul off, man. Shake your boots." There were two of them, and Space Force guards aren't picked for their good looks. Just the same, I gave a pretty good account of myself until the inner door opened and a man came storming out. "What the devil is all this racket?" One guard got a hammerlock on me. "This dry-towner bum tried to talk us into making a priority call to Magnuson, the chief at Central. He knew a couple of the SS passwords. That's what's got him through the gate. Remember, Cargill passed the word that somebody would turn up trying to impersonate him." "I remember." The strange man's eyes were wary and cold. "You damned fools," I snarled. "Magnuson will identify me. Can't you realize you're dealing with an imposter?" One of the guards said to the legate in an undertone, "Maybe we ought to hold him as a suspicious character." But the legate shook his head. "Not worth the trouble. Cargill said it was a private affair. You might search him. Make sure he's not concealing contraband weapons," he added, and talked softly to the wide-eyed clerk in the background while the guards went through my shirt cloak and pockets. When they started to unwrap the silk-shrouded toy, I yelled. If the thing got set off accidentally, there'd be trouble. The legate turned and rebuked. "Can't you see it's embroidered with the toad god? It's a religious amulet of some sort. Let it alone." They grumbled, but gave it back to me, and the legate commanded, "Don't mess him up any more. Give him back his knife and take him to the gates, but make sure he doesn't come back." I found myself seized and frog-marched to the gate. One guard pushed my skein back into its clasp, the other shoved me hard, and I stumbled, fell sprawling in the dust of the cobbled street, to the accompaniment of a profane statement about what I could expect if I came back. A chorus of jeers from a cluster of chalk children and veiled women broke across me. I picked myself up, glowered so fiercely at the giggling spectators that the laughter drained away into silence, and clenched my fists, half inclined to turn back and bull my way through. Then I subsided. First round, to Racal. He had sprung the trap on me very neatly. The street was narrow and crooked, winding between doubled rows of pebble houses and full of dark shadows even in the crimson noon. I walked aimlessly, favoring the arm the guard had crushed. I was no closer to settling things with Racal, and I had slammed at least one gate behind me. Why hadn't I had sense enough to walk up and demand to see Race Cargill? Why hadn't I insisted on a fingerprint check? I could prove my identity and recall, using my name in my absence to those who didn't know me by sight. Couldn't. I could at least have made him try. But he had maneuvered it very cleverly, so I never had a chance to insist on proofs. I turned into a wine shop and ordered a dram of greenish mountainberry liquor, sipping it slowly and fingering the few bills and coins in my pockets. I'd better forget about warning Julie. I couldn't vise her from Charon, except in the Terran zone. I had neither the money nor the time to make the trip in person, even if I could get passage on a Terran-dominated airline after today. Mei Lin. She had flirted with me, and like Dalisa, she might prove vulnerable. It might be another trap, but I'd take the chance. At least I could get hints about Everin, and I needed information. I wasn't used to this kind of intrigue anymore. The smell of danger was foreign to me now, and I found it unpleasant. The small lump of the bird in my pocket tantalized me. I took it out again. It was a temptation to press the stud and let it settle things, or at least start them going, then and there. After a while I noticed the proprietors of the shop staring at the silk of the wrappings. They backed off, apprehensive. I held out a coin, and they shook their heads. "You are welcome to the drink," one of them said. "All we have is at your service. Only, please go. Go quickly." They would not touch the coins I offered. I thrust the bird in my pocket, swore, and went. It was my second experience with being somehow taboo, and I didn't like it. It was dusk when I realized I was being followed. At first it was a glimpse out of the corner of my eye, a head seen too frequently for coincidence. It developed into a too persistent footstep in uneven rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. I had my skein handy, but I had a hunch this wasn't anything I could settle with a skein. I ducked into a side street and waited. Nothing. I went on, laughing at my imagined fears. And then, after a time, the soft, persistent footfall thudded behind me again. I cut across a thieves' market, dodging from stall to stall, cursed by old women selling hot fried goldfish, women in striped veils railing at me in their chiming talk when I brushed their rolled rugs with hasty feet. Far behind I heard the familiar, uneven hurry. Tap, 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 tap. I fled down a street where women sat on flower-decked balconies, their open lanterns flowing with fountains and rivulets of gold and orange fire. I raced through quiet streets where furred children crept to doors and watched me pass with great golden eyes that shone in the dark. I dodged into an alley and lay there, breathing hard. Someone, not 2 inches away, said, "Are you one of us, brother?" I muttered something surly in his dialect, and a hand, reassuringly human, closed on my elbow. "This way." Out of breath with long running, I let him lead me, meaning to break away after a few steps, apologize for mistaken identity, and vanish, when a sound at the end of the street made me jerk stiff and listen. Tap, 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 tap. I let my arm relax in the hand that guided me, flung a fold of my shirt cloak over my face, and went along with my unknown guide. End of Chapter 12.
Chapter 13 of The Door Through Space. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clive Catterall. The Door Through Space by Marion Zimmer Bradley. Chapter 13. I stumbled over steps, took a jolting stride downward, and found myself in a dim room jammed with dark figures, human and non-human. The figures swayed in the darkness, chanting in a dialect not altogether familiar to me, a monotonous, wailing chant with a single recurrent phrase, Kamaina, Kamaina. It began on a high note, descending in weird chromatics to the lowest tone the human ear could resolve. The sound made me draw back. Even the Dry-towners shunned the orgiastic rituals of Kamaina. Earthmen have a reputation for getting rid of the more objectionable customs, by human standards, on any planet where they live. But they don't touch religions, and Kamaina, on the surface anyhow, was a religion. I started to turn round and leave, as if I had inadvertently walked through the wrong door, but my conductor hauled on my arm, and I was wedged in too tight by now to risk a roughhouse. Trying to force my way out would only have called attention to me, and the first of the Secret Service maxims is, When in doubt, go along, keep quiet, and watch the other guy. As my eyes adapted to the dim light, I saw that most of the crowd were Terran plainsmen or chaks. One or two wore Drytown shirt cloaks, and I even thought I saw an Earthman in the crowd, though I was never sure, and I fervently hoped not. They were squatting around small crescent-shaped tables, and all intently gazing at a flickery spot of light at the front of the cellar. I saw an empty place at one table and dropped there, finding the floor soft as if cushioned. On each table, small smudging pastilles were burning, and from these cones of ash-tipped fire came the steamy, swimmy smoke that filled the darkness with strange colors. Beside me, an immature chat girl was kneeling, her fettered hands strained tightly back at her sides, her naked breasts pierced for jeweled rings. Beneath the pallid fur around her pointed ears, the exquisite animal face was quite mad. She whispered to me, but her dialect was so thick that I could follow only a few words, and would just as soon not have heard those few. An older chak grunted for silence, and she subsided, swaying and crooning. There were cups and decanters on all the tables, and a woman tilted pale phosphorescent fluid into a cup and offered it to me. I took one sip, then another. It was cold and pleasantly tart, and not until the second swallow turned sweet on my tongue did I know what I tasted. I pretended to swallow while the woman's eyes were fixed on me, then somehow contrived to spill the filthy stuff down my shirt. I was wary even of the fumes, but there was nothing else I could do. The stuff was shalavan, outlawed on every planet in the Terran Empire, and every halfway decent planet outside it. More and more figures, men and creatures, kept crowding into the cellar, which was not very large. The place looked like the worst nightmare of a drug dreamer, ablaze with the colors of the smoking incense, the swaying crowd and their monotonous cries. Quite suddenly there was a blaze of purple light, and someone screamed in raving ecstasy, "Nakina Nibran, Nahai Kamaina!" "Kamaina!" shrilled the tranced mob. An old man jumped up and started haranguing the crowd. I could just follow his dialect. He was talking about terror. He was talking about riots. He was jabbering mystical gibberish which I couldn't understand, and didn't want to understand, and rebel-rousing anti-Terran propaganda which I understood much too well. Another blaze of lights, and a long scream in chorus, "Kamaina!" Everin stood in the blaze of many-colored light. The Toymaker, as I had seen him last, cat-smooth, gracefully alien, shrouded in a ripple of giddy crimsons. Behind him was a blackness. I waited till the painful blaze of lights abated, then, straining my eyes to see past him, I got my worst shock. A woman stood there, naked to the waist, her hands ritually fettered with little chains that stirred and clashed musically as she moved, stiff-legged in a frozen dream. Hair like black grass banded her brow and naked shoulders, and her eyes were crimson. And the eyes lived in the dread, dreaming face. They lived, and they were mad with terror, although the lips curved in a gently tranced smile. Mei Lin. Everin was speaking in that dialect I barely understood. His arms were flung high, and his cloak went spilling away from them, rippling like something alive. The jammed humans and non-humans swayed and chanted, and he swayed above them like an iridescent bug, weaving arms rippling back and forth, back and forth. I strained to catch his words. Our world. An old world. "Kamaina!" whimpered the shrill chorus. Humans, humans, all humans would make slaves of us all save the children of the ape. I lost the thread for a moment, true. The Terran Empire has one small blind spot in otherwise sane policy, ignoring that non-human and human have lived placidly here for millennia. They placidly assume that humans were everywhere the dominant race, as on Earth itself. The Toymaker's weaving arms went on spinning, spinning, I rubbed my eyes to clear them of shalavan and incense. I hoped that what I saw was an illusion of the drug. Something huge and dark was hovering over the girl. She stood placidly, hands clasped on her chains, but her eyes writhed in the frozen calm of her face. Then something, I can only call it a sixth sense, bore it on me that there was someone outside the door. I was perhaps the only creature there, except for Everin, not drugged with shalavan, and perhaps that's all it was. But during the days in the Secret Service, I'd had to develop some extra senses. 5 just weren't enough for survival. I knew somebody was fixing to break down that door, and I had a good idea why. I had been followed by the Legate's orders, and tracking me here, they'd gone away and brought back reinforcements. Someone struck a blow on the door, and a stentorian voice bawled, "Open up there, in the name of the Empire!" The chanting broke in ragged quavers. Everin stopped. Somewhere a woman screamed. The lights abruptly went out, and a stampede started in the room. Women struck me with chains. Men kicked. There were shrieks and howls. I thrust my way forward, butting with elbows and knees and shoulders. A dusky emptiness yawned, and I got a glimpse of sunlight and open sky, and knew that Everin had stepped through into somewhere and was gone. The banging on the door sounded like a whole regiment of Space Force out there. I dived toward the shimmer of little stars which marked Malin's tiara in the darkness, braving the black horror hovering above her, and touched rigid girl flesh, cold as death. I grabbed her and ducked sideways. This time it wasn't intuition. 9 times out of 10, anyway, intuition is just a mental shortcut which adds up all the things which your subconscious has noticed while you were busy thinking about something else. Every native building on Wolf had concealed entrances and exits, and I knew where to look for them. This one was exactly where I expected. I pushed at it and found myself in a long, dim corridor. The head of a woman peered from an opening door. She saw Malin's limp body hanging on my arm, and her mouth widened in a silent scream. Then the head popped back out of sight and a door slammed. I heard the bolt slide. I ran for the end of the hall, the girl in my arms, thinking that this was where I came in as far as Malin was concerned, and wondering why I bothered. The door opened on a dark, peaceful street. One lonely moon was setting beyond the rooftops. I set Malin on her feet, but she moaned and crumpled against me. I put my shirt cloak round her bare shoulders. Judging by the noises and yells, we'd gotten out just in time. No one came out the exit behind us. Either the Space Force had plugged it, or, more likely, everyone else in the cellar had been too muddled by drugs to know what was going on. But it was only a few minutes, I knew, before Space Force would check the whole building for concealed escape holes. Suddenly, and irrelevantly, I found myself thinking of a day not too long ago, when I'd stood up in front of a unit in training of Space Force, introduced to them as an intelligence expert on native towns, and solemnly warned them about concealed exits and entrances. I wondered, for half a minute, if it might not be simpler just to wait here and let them pick me up. Then I hoisted Malin across my shoulders. She was heavier than she looked, and after a minute, half conscious, she began to struggle and moan. There was a check-run cookshop down the street, a place I'd once known well, with an evil reputation and worse food, but it was quiet and stayed open all night. I turned in at the door, bending at the low lintel. The place was smoke-filled and foul-smelling. I dumped Malin on a couch, and sent the frowsy waiter for 2 bowls of noodles and coffee, handed him a few extra coins, and told him to leave us alone. He probably drew the worst possible inference. I saw his muzzle twitch at the smell of shalavan, but it was that kind of place anyhow. He drew down the shutters and went. I stared at the unconscious girl, then shrugged and started on the noodles. My own head was still swimmy with the fumes, incense and drug, and I wanted it clear. I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I had Everin's right-hand girl, and I was going to use her. The noodles were greasy and had a curious taste, but they were hot, and I ate all of one bowl before Malin stirred and whimpered and put up one hand with a little clinking of chains to her hair. The gesture was indefinably reminiscent of Dalisa, and for the first time I saw the likeness between them. It made me wary, and yet curiously softened. Finding she could not move freely, she rolled over, sat up, and stared around in growing bewilderment and dismay. "There was a sort of riot," I said. "I got you out. Evelyn ditched you, and you can quit thinking what you're thinking. I put my shirt cloak on you because you were bare to the waist, and it didn't look so good." I stopped to think that over, and amended. "I mean, I couldn't haul you around the streets that way. It looked good enough." To my surprise, she gave a shaky little giggle and held out her fettered hands. "Will you?" I broke her links and freed her. She rubbed her wrists as if they hurt her, then drew up her draperies, pinned them so that she was decently covered, and tossed back my shirt cloak. Her eyes were wide and soft in the light of a flickering stub of candle. "Oh, Rakhal," she sighed, "when I saw you there." She sat up, clasping her hands together, and when she continued, her voice was curiously cold and controlled for anyone so childish. It was almost as cold as Dalisa's. "If you've come from Kiral, I'm not going back. I'll never go back, and you may as well know it." "I don't come from Kiral, and I don't care where you go." "I don't care what you do." I suddenly realized that the last statement was wholly untrue, and to cover my confusion I shoved the remaining bowl of noodles at her. "Eat." She wrinkled her nose in fastidious disgust. "I'm not hungry." "Eat it anyway. You're still half doped, and the food will clear your head." I picked up one mug of the coffee and drained it at a single swallow. What were you doing in that disgusting den? Without warning, she flung herself across the table at me, throwing her arms around my neck. Startled, I let her cling a moment, then reached up and firmly unfastened her hands. None of that now. I fell for it once, and it landed me in the middle of the mud pie. But her fingers bit my shoulder. "Rakhal, Rakhal, I tried to get away and find you. Have you still got the bird? You haven't set it off yet. Oh, don't, Rakhal. You don't know what Everin is. You don't know what he's doing." The words spilled out of her like floodwaters. "He's won so many of you. Don't let him have you too, Rakhal. They call you an honest man. You worked once for Terra. The Terrans would believe you if you went to them and told them what he... Rakhal, take me to the Terran zone. Take me there. Take me where they'll protect me from Everin." At first I tried to stop her, question her, then waited and let the torrent of entreaty run on and on. At last, exhausted and breathless, she lay quietly against my shoulder, her head fallen forward. The musty reek of Shalavan mingled with the flower scent of her hair. "Kid," I said heavily at last, "you and your toy maker have both got me wrong. I'm not Rakhal Sensar." "You're not?" She drew back, regarding me in dismay. Her eyes searched every inch of me, from the grey streak across my forehead to the scar running down into my collar. "Then who—" "Race Cargill. Terran Intelligence." She stared, her mouth wide like a child's. Then she laughed. She laughed! At first I thought she was hysterical. I stared at her in consternation. Then, as her wide eyes met mine, with all the mischief of the non-human which was mingled into the human here, all the circular complexities of wolfy logic behind the woman in them, I started to laugh too. I threw back my head and roared until we were clinging together and gasping with mirth like a pair of raving fools. The Chak waiter came to the door and stared at us, and I roared, "Get the hell out!" between spasms of crazy laughter. Then she was wiping her face, tears of mirth still dripping down her cheeks, and I was frowning bleakly into the empty bowls. "Cargill," she said hesitantly, "you can take me to the Terrans where Rakhal—" "Hell's bells!" I exploded. "I can't take you anywhere, girl. I've got to find Rakhal." I stopped in mid-sentence and looked at her clearly for the first time. "Child, I'll see that you're protected if I can, but I'm afraid you've walked from the trap to the cookpot. There isn't a house in Charin that will hold me. Been thrown out twice today." She nodded. "I don't know how the word spreads, but it happens in non-human parts. I think they can see trouble written in a human face, or smell it in the wind." She fell silent, her face propped sleepily between her hands, her hair falling in tangles. I took one of her hands in mine and turned it over. It was a fine hand, with bird-like bones and soft rose-tinted nails, but the lines and hardened places around the knuckles reminded me that she, too, came from the cold austerity of the salt dry towns. After a moment she flushed and drew her hand from mine. "What are you thinking, Cargill?" she asked, and for the first time I heard her voice sobered, without the coquetry, which must, after all, have been a very thin veneer. I answered her simply and literally. "I'm thinking of Dallisa. I thought you were very different, and yet I see that you are very like her." I thought she would question what I knew of her sister, but she let it pass in silence. After a time she said, "Yes, we were twins." Then, after a long silence, she added, "But she was always much the older." And that was all I ever knew of whatever obscure pressures had shaped Dallisa into an austere and tragic Clytemnestra, and Malin into a pixie runaway. Outside the drawn shutters dawn was brightening. Malin shivered, drawing her thin draperies around her bare throat. I glanced at the little rim of jewels that starred her hair, and said, "You'd better take those off and hide them. They alone would be enough to have you hauled into an alley and strangled in this part of Charin." I hauled the bird toy from my pocket and slapped it on the greasy table, still wrapped in its silk. "I don't suppose you know which of us this thing is set to kill?" "I know nothing about the toys." "You seem to know plenty about the toy maker." "I thought so, until last night." I looked at the rigid, clamped mouth, and thought that if she were really as soft and as delicate as she looked, she would have wept. Then she struck her small hand on the tabletop and burst out, "It's not a religion. It isn't even an honest movement for freedom. It's a front for smuggling and drugs and every other filthy thing. Believe it or not, when I left Shensar, I thought Nebran was the answer to the way the Terrans were strangling us. Now I know there are worse things on Wolf than the Terran Empire. I've heard of Rakhal Sensar, and whatever you may think of Rakhal, he's too decent to be mixed up in anything like this." "Suppose you tell me what's really going on," I suggested. She couldn't add much to what I knew already, but the last fragments of the pattern were beginning to settle into place. Rakhal, seeking the matter transmitter and some key to the non-human sciences of Wolf, I knew now what the city of the Silent Ones had reminded me of, had somehow crossed the path of the Toymaker. Everin's words now made sense. "You were clever at evading our surveillance for a while." Possibly, though I'd never know, Quinn had been keeping one foot in each camp, working for Kiral and for Everin. The Toymaker, knowing of Rakhal's anti-Terran activities, had believed he would make a valuable ally, and had taken steps to secure his help. Julie herself had given me the clue. He smashed Rindy's toys. Out of the context, it sounded like the work of a madman. Now, having encountered Everin's workshop, it made plain good sense. And I think I had known all along that Rakhal could not have been playing Everin's game. He might have turned against Terra, though now I was beginning to even doubt that, and certainly he'd have killed me if he found me. But he would have done it himself, and without malice. Killed without malice, that doesn't make sense in any of the languages of Terra, but it made sense to me. Malin had finished her brief recitation and was drowsing, her head pillowed on the table. The reddish light was growing, and I realized that I was waiting for dawn as, days ago, I had waited for sunset in Shensar, with every nerve stretched to the breaking point. It was dawn of the third morning, and this bird lying on the table before me must fly, or far away in the Khasa another would fly at Julie. I said, "There's some distance limitation on this one, I understand, since I have to be fairly near its object. If I lock it in a steel box and drop it in the desert, I'll guarantee it won't bother anybody. I don't suppose you'd have a shot at stealing the other one for me?" She raised her head, eyes flashing. "Why should you worry about Rakhal's wife?" she flared. And for no good reason it occurred to me that she was jealous. I might have known Everin wouldn't shoot in the dark. Rakhal's wife, that Earthwoman, what do you care for her? It seemed important to set her straight. I explained that Julie was my sister, and saw a little of the tension fade from her face, but not all. Remembering the custom of the Dry Towns, I was not wholly surprised when she added jealously, "When I heard of your feud, I guessed it was over that woman." "But not in the way you think," I said. "Julie had been part of it, certainly. Even then, I had not wanted her to turn her back on her world. But if Rakhal had remained with Terra, I would have accepted his marriage to Julie. Accepted it? I'd have rejoiced. God knows we'd been closer than brothers, those years in the Dry Towns. And then, before Malin's flashing eyes, I suddenly faced my secret hate, my secret fear. No, the quarrel had not been all Rakhal's doing. He had not turned his back, unexplained, on Terra. In some unrecognized fashion, I had done my best to drive him away. And when he had gone, I had banished a part of myself as well, and thought I could end the struggle by saying it didn't exist. And now, facing what I had done to all of us, I knew that my revenge, so long sought, so dearly cherished, must be abandoned. "We still have to deal with the bird," I said. "It's a gamble, with all the cards wild. I could dismantle it and trust to luck that Wolf Illogic didn't include a tamper mechanism, but that didn't seem worth the risk. First, I've got to find Rakhal. If I set the bird free and it killed him, it wouldn't settle anything. For I could not kill Rakhal. Not now, because I knew life would be a worse punishment than death, but because, if I knew it now, if Rakhal died, Julie would die too. And if I killed him, I'd be killing the best part of myself. Somehow, Rakhal and I must strike a balance between our two worlds and try to build a new one from them. And I can't sit here and talk any longer. I haven't time to take you—" I stopped, remembering the spaceport cafe at the edge of the Kharsa. There was a street shrine or matter transmitter right there, across the street from the Terran HQ. All these years. You know your way in the transmitters. You can go there in a second or two. She could warn Julie. Tell Magnusson. But when I suggested this, giving her a password that would take her straight to the top, she turned white. All jumps have to be made through the Master Shrine. I stopped and thought about that. Where is Everin likely to be, right now? She gave a nervous shudder. He's everywhere. Rubbish. He's not omniscient. Why, you little fool, he didn't even recognize me. He thought I was Rakhal. I wasn't too sure myself, but Malin needed reassurance. Or take me to the Master Shrine. I can find Rakhal in that scanning device of Everin's. I saw refusal in her face and pushed on. If Everin's there, I'll prove he's fallible enough with a skein in his throat. And here, I thrust the toy into her hand. Hang on to this, will you? She put it matter-of-factly into her draperies. I don't mind that, but to the shrine. Her voice quivered, and I stood up and pushed at the table. Let's get going. Where's the nearest street shrine? No. Oh, I don't dare. You've got to. I saw the chak who owned the place edging round the door again and said, "There's no use arguing, Malin." When she had readjusted her robes a little while ago, she had pinned them so that the flat sprawl of the Nebran embroideries were over her breasts. I put a finger against them, not in a sensuous gesture, and said, "The minute they see these, they'll throw us out of here too. If you knew what I know of Nebran, you wouldn't want me to go near the Master Shrine again." There was that faint coquettishness in her sideways smile, and suddenly I realized that I didn't want her to. But she was not Dalisa, and she could not sit in cold dignity while her world fell into ruin. Malin must fight for the one she wanted. And then some of that primitive male hostility which lives in every man came to the surface, and I gripped her arm until she whimpered. Then I said, in the Shane San which still comes to my tongue when moved or angry, "Damn it, you're going! Have you forgotten that if it weren't for me, you'd have been torn to pieces by that raving mob, or something worse?" That did it. She pulled away, and I saw again, beneath the veneer of petulant coquetry, that fierce and untamable insolence of the Dry Towner. the more fierce and arrogant in this girl because she had burst her fettered hands free and shaken off the ruin of the past. I was seized with a wildly inappropriate desire to seize her, crush her in my arms, taste the red honey of that teasing mouth. The effort of mastering the impulse made me rough. I shoved at her and said, "Come on, let's get there before Everin does." End of chapter 13. Of The Door Through Space. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clive Catterall. The Door Through Space by Marion Zimmer Bradley. Chapter 14. Outside in the streets it was full day, and the colour and life of Terran had subsided into listlessness again, a dim, morning dullness and silence. Only a few men lounged wearily in the streets, as if the sun had sapped their energy. And always the pale, fleecy-haired children, human and furred non-human, played their mysterious games on the curbs and gutters, and staring at us with neither curiosity nor malice. Maylin was shaking when she set her feet into the patterned stones of the street shrine. "Scared, Maylin? I know, Everin, you don't, but—" Her mouth twitched in a painful attempt at the old mischief. "When I'm with a great and valorous Earthman—" "Cut it out," I growled, and she giggled. "We'll have to stand closer to me. The transmitters are meant only for one person." I stooped and put my arms round her. "Like this?" "Like this," she whispered, pressing herself against me. A staggering whirl of dizzy darkness swung around my head. The street vanished. After an instant, the floor steadied and we stepped into the terminal room in the master shrine, under a skylight dim with the last red slant of sunset. Distant hammering noises rang in my ears. Maylin whispered, "Everin's not here, but he might jump through at any second." I wasn't listening. "Where is this place, Maylin? Where on the planet?" "No one knows but Everin, I think. There are no doors. Anyone who goes in or out jumps through the transmitter." She pointed. "The scanning device is in there. We'll have to go through the workroom." She was patting her cushioned robes into place, smoothing her hair with fastidious fingers. "I don't suppose you have a comb? I've no time to go to my own—" I'd known she was a vain and pampered brat, but this passed all reason, and I said so, exploding at her. She looked at me as if I wasn't quite intelligent. "Little ones, my friend, notice things. You are quite enough of a redneck, but I, Nebran's priestess, walk through their workroom all blown out and looking like the tag end of an orgy in Adkaran." Abashed, I fished in my pocket and offered her a somewhat battered pocket comb. She looked at it distastefully, but used it to good purpose, smoothing her hair swiftly, rearranging her loose-pinned robe so that the worst of the tears and stains were covered, giving me meanwhile an artless and rather tempting view of some delicious curvature. She replaced the starred tiara on her ringlets, and finally opened the door of the workroom, and we walked through. Not for years had I known that particular sensation, thousands of eyes boring holes in the center of my back somewhere. There were eyes, the round inhuman orbs of the dwarf chaks, the faceted stare of the prism eyes of the toys. The workroom wasn't 100 feet long, but it felt longer than a good many miles I'd walked. Here and there the dwarfs murmured an obsequious greeting to Maylin, and she made some light-hearted answer. She had warned me to walk as if I had every right to be there, and I strode after her as if we were simply going to an agreed-on meeting in the next room. But I was drenched with cold sweat before the further door finally closed, safe and blessedly opaque, behind us. Maylin, too, was shaking with fright, and I put a hand on her arm. "Steady, kid. Where's the scanner?" She touched the panel I'd seen. "I'm not sure if I can focus it accurately. Everin never let me touch it." This was a fine time to tell me that. "How does it work?" "It's an adaptation of the transmitter principle. It lets you see anywhere, but without jumping. It uses a tracer mechanism, like the one in the toys. If Rakhal's electrical impulse pattern were on file... Just a minute. She fished out the bird toy and unwrapped it. Here's how we find out which of you this is keyed to. I looked at the fledgling bird, lying innocently in her palm, as she pushed aside the feathers, exposing a tiny crystal. If it's keyed to you, you'll see yourself in this, as if the screen were a mirror. If it's keyed to Rakhal... She touched the crystal to the surface of the screen. Little flickers of snow wavered and danced. Then abruptly we were looking down from a height at the lean back of a man in a leather jacket. Slowly he turned. I saw the familiar set of his shoulders, saw the back of his head come into an aquiline profile, and the profile turned slowly into a scarred, seared mask, more hideously claw-marked and disfigured than my own. Rakhal, I muttered. Shift the focus if you can, Malin. Get a look out of the window or something. Charon's a big city. If we could get a good look at a landmark... Rakhal was talking soundlessly, his lips moving as he spoke to someone out of sight range of the scanning device. Abruptly, Malin said, "There." She had caught a window in the sight field of the pane. I could see a high pylon and 2 or 3 uprights that looked like a bridge just outside. I said, "It's the bridge of summer snows. I know where he is now. Turn it off, Malin. We can find him." I was turning away when Malin screamed, "Look!" Rakhal had turned his back on the scanner, and for the first time I could see who he was talking to. A hunched, cat-like shoulder twisted, a sinuous neck, high-held head that was not quite human. "Evarin," I swore. "That does it. He knows now that I'm not Rakhal, if he didn't know it all along. Come on, girl. We're getting out of here." This time there was no pretense of normality as we dashed through the workroom. Fingers dropped from half-completed toys as they stared after us. Toys! I wanted to stop and smash them all. But if we hurried, we might find Rakhal, and with luck we would find Evarin with him. And then I was going to bang their heads together. I'd reached a saturation point on adventure. I'd had all I wanted. I realized that I'd been up all night, that I was exhausted. I wanted to murder and smash. I wanted to fall down somewhere and go to sleep, all at once. We banged the workroom door shut, and I took time to shove a heavy divan against it, blockading it. Malin stared. "The little ones wouldn't harm me," she began. "I'm sacrosanct." I wasn't sure. I had a notion her status had changed plenty, beginning when I saw her chained and drugged and standing under the hovering horror. But I didn't say so. Maybe. But there's nothing sacred about me. She was already inside the recess where the toad god swatted. "There is a street shrine just beyond the bridge of summer snows. We can jump directly there." Abruptly, she froze in my arms with a convulsive shudder. "Evarin, hold me tight. He's jumping in. Quick!" Space reeled around us, and then... Can you split instantaneousness into fragments? It didn't make sense. But so help me, that's what happened. And everything that happened occurred within less than a second. We landed in the street shrine. I could see the pylon and the bridge, and the rising sun of Charon. Then there was a giddy internal wrenching. A blast of icy air whistled round us, and we were gazing out at the polar mountains, ringed in their eternal snow. Malin clutched at me. "Pray, pray to the gods of terror, if there are any." She clung so violently that it felt as if her small body were trying to push through me and come out the other side. I hung on tight. Malin knew what she was doing in the transmitter. I was just along for the ride, and I didn't relish the thought of being dropped off somewhere in that black limbo we traversed. We jumped again, the sickness of disorientation forcing a moan from the girl, and darkness shivered round us. I looked on an unfamiliar street of black night and dust-bleared stars. She whimpered, "Evarin knows what I'm doing. He's jumping us all over the planet. He can work the controls with his mind. Psychokinetics, I can do it a little, but I never dared. Oh, hang on tight." Then began one of the most amazing duels ever fought. Malin would make some tiny movement, and we would be falling, blind and dizzy, through blackness. Halfway through the giddiness, a new direction would wrench us, and we would be thrust elsewhere, and look out into a new street. One instant I smelled hot coffee from the spaceport cafe near the Kharsa. An instant later it was blinding noon, with crimson fronds waving above us and a dazzle of water. We flicked in and out of the salty air of Shainsa, glimpsed flowers and a Dailon street. Moonlight, noon, red twilight flickered and went, shot through with the terrible giddiness of hyperspace. Then suddenly I caught a second glimpse of the bridge and the pylon. A moment's oversight had landed us for an instant in Sharin. The blackness started to reel down, but my reflexes are fast, and I made one swift, scrabbling step forward. We lurched, sprawled, locked together on the stones of the bridge of summer snows. Battered and bruised and bloody, we were still alive, and where we wanted to be. I lifted Maylin to her feet. Her eyes were dazed with pain. The ground swayed and rocked under our feet as we fled along the bridge. At the far end, I looked up at the pylon. Judging from its angle, we couldn't be more than 100 feet from the window through which I'd seen that landmark in the scanner. In this street, there was a wine shop, a silk market, and a small private house. I walked up and banged on the door. Silence. I knocked again, and had time to wonder if we'd find ourselves explaining things to some uninvolved stranger. Then I heard a child's high voice, and a deep, familiar voice hushing it. The door opened, just a crack, to reveal part of a scarred face. It drew into a hideous grin, then relaxed. I thought it might be you, Cargill. You've taken at least 3 days longer than I figured getting here. Come on in, said Rakhal Sensar. End of chapter 14. Of The Door Through Space. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Clive Catterall. The Door Through Space by Marion Zimmer Bradley. Chapter 15. He hadn't changed much in 6 years. His face was worse than mine. He hadn't had the plastic surgeons of Terran Intelligence doing their best for him. His mouth, I thought fleetingly, must hurt like hell when he drew it up into the kind of grin he was grinning now. His eyebrows, thick and fierce with grey in them, went up as he saw Maylin, but he backed away to let us enter, and shut the door behind us. The room was bare, and didn't look as if it had been lived in much. The floor was stone, rough laid, a single fur rug laid before a brazier. A little girl was sitting on the rug, drinking from a big double-handled mug, but she scrambled to her feet as we came in, and backed against the wall, looking at us with wide eyes. She had pale red hair like Julie's, cut straight in a fringe across her forehead, and she was dressed in a smock of dyed red fur that almost matched her hair. A little smear of milk, like a white moustache, clung to her upper lip, where she'd forgotten to wipe her mouth. She was about 5 years old, with deep-set dark eyes like Julie's, that watched me gravely, without surprise or fear. She evidently knew who I was. "Rindy," Rakhal said quietly, not taking his eyes from me. "Go into the other room." Rindy didn't move, still staring at me. Then she moved towards Maylin, looking up intently, not at the woman, but at the pattern of embroideries across her dress. It was very quiet, until Rakhal added, in a gentle and curiously moderate voice, "Do you still carry a skein, Race?" I shook my head. There's an ancient proverb on Terra about blood being thicker than water, Rakhal. That's Julie's daughter. I'm not going to kill her father right before her eyes. My rage spilled over then, and I bellowed, "To hell with your damn Dry Town feuds, and your filthy toad god, and all the rest of it." Rakhal said harshly, "Rindy, I told you to get out." "She needn't go." I took a step towards the little girl, a wary eye on Rakhal. "I don't know quite what you're up to, but it's nothing for a child to be mixed up in. Do what you damn please. I can settle with you any time. The first thing is to get Rindy out of here. She belongs with Julie, and damn it, that's where she's going." I held out my arms to the little girl and said, "It's over, Rindy. Whatever he's done to you, your mother sent me to find you. Don't you want to go to your mother?" Rakhal made a menacing gesture and warned I wouldn't. Maylin darted swiftly between us and caught up the child in her arms. Rindy began to struggle noiselessly, kicking and whimpering, but Maylin took 2 quick steps and flung an inner door open. Rakhal took a stride toward her. She whirled on him, fighting to control the furious little girl, and gasped, "Settle it between you, without the baby watching." Through the open door I briefly saw a bed, a child's small dresses hanging on a hook, before Maylin kicked the door shut and I heard a latch being fastened. Behind the closed door, Rindy broke into angry screams, but I put my back against the door. "She's right. We'll settle it between the 2 of us. What have you done to the child?" "If you thought..." Rakhal stopped himself in mid-sentence and stood watching me, without moving, for a minute. Then he laughed. "You're as stupid as ever, Race. Why, you fool, I knew Julie would run straight to you, if she was scared enough. I knew it would bring you out of hiding. Why, you damn fool." He stood mocking me, but there was a strained fury, almost a frenzy of contempt behind the laughter. "You filthy coward, Race. 6 years hiding in the Terran zone. 6 years, and I gave you 6 months. If you'd had the guts to walk out after me, after I rigged that final deal to give you the chance, we could have gone after the biggest thing on Wolf. And we could have brought it off together, instead of spending years spying and dodging and hunting. And now, when I finally get you out of hiding, all you want to do is run back where you'll be safe. I thought you had more guts. Not for Everin's dirty work." Rakhal swore hideously. "Everin? Do you really believe... I might have known he'd get to you too. That girl... And you managed to wreck all I did there too." Suddenly, so swiftly my eyes could hardly follow, he whipped out his skean and came at me. "Get away from that door." I stood my ground. "You'll have to kill me first. And I won't fight you, Rakhal. We'll settle this, but we'll do it my way for once, like Earthmen." "Son of the ape, get your skean out, you stinking coward." "I won't do it, Rakhal." I stood and defied him. I had outmaneuvered Dry Towners in a shegri bet. I knew Rakhal, and I knew he would not knife an unarmed man. We fought once with the Kifar, and it didn't settle anything. This time we'll do it my way. I threw my skean away before I came here. I won't fight." He thrust at me. Even I could see that the blow was a feint, and I had a flashing, instantaneous memory of Dallisa's threat to drive the knife through my palms. But even while I commanded myself to stand steady, sheer reflex threw me forward, grabbing at his wrist and the knife. Between my grappling hand he twisted, and I felt the skean drive home, rip through my jacket with a tearing sound. Felt the thin, fine line of touch, not pain yet, as it sliced flesh. The pain burned through my ribs, and I felt hot blood, and I wanted to kill Rakhal, wanted to get my hands round his throat and kill him with them. At the same time I was raging because I didn't want to fight the crazy fool. I wasn't even mad at him. Maylin flung the door open, shrieking, and suddenly the toy, released, was darting a small, whirring, droning horror straight at Rakhal's eyes. I yelled, but there was no time to warn him. I bent and butted him in the stomach. He grunted, doubled up in agony, and fell out of the path of the diving toy. It whirred in frustration, hovered. He writhed in agony, drawing up his knees, clawing at his shirt, while I turned on Maylin in immense fury and stopped. Hers had been a move of desperation, an instinctive act to restore the balance between a weaponless man and one who had a knife. Rakhal gasped in a hoarse voice, with all the breath gone from it. "Didn't want to use. Rather fight clean." Then he opened his closed fist, and suddenly there were 2 of the little whirring, droning horrors in the room, and this one was diving at me. And as I threw myself headlong to the floor, the last puzzle piece fell into place. Everin had made the same bargain with Rakhal as with me. I rolled over, dodging. Behind me in the room there was a child's shrill scream, "Daddy! Daddy!" And abruptly the birds collapsed in mid-air and went limp. They fell to the floor like dropping stones, and lay there quivering. Rindy dashed across the room, her small skirts flying, and grabbed up one of the terrible vicious things in either hand. "Rindy!" I bellowed. "No!" She stood shaking, tears pouring down her round cheeks, a toy squeezed tight in either hand. Dark veins stood out almost black on her fair temples. "Break them, Daddy," she implored in a little thread of a voice. "Break them quick. I can't hang on." Rakhal staggered to his feet like a drunken man and snatched one of the toys, grinding it under his heel. He made a grab at the second, reeled and drew in an anguished breath. He crumpled up, clutching at his belly where I'd butted him. The bird screamed like a living thing. Breaking the paralysis of horror, I leapt up, ran across the room, heedless of the searing pain along my side. I snatched the bird from Rindy as it screamed and shrilled, and died as my foot crunched the tiny feathers. I stamped the still moving thing into an amorphous mess, and kept on stamping and smashing until it was only a heap of powder. Rakhal finally managed to haul himself upright again. His face was so pale that the scars stood out like fresh burns. "That was a foul blow, Race, but I know why you did it." He stopped and breathed for a minute. Then he muttered, "You saved my life, you know. Did you know you were doing it when you did it?" Still breathing hard, I nodded. Done knowingly, it meant an end of blood-feud. However, we had wronged each other, whatever the pledges. I spoke the words that confirmed it and ended it, finally and forever. There is a life between us. Let it stand for a death. Maylin was standing in the doorway, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide. She said shakily, "You're walking around with a knife in your ribs, you fool." Rakhal whirled, and with a quick jerk he pulled the skein loose. It had simply been caught in my shirt cloak, in a fold of the rough cloth. He pulled it away, glanced at the red tip, then relaxed. "Not more than an inch deep," he said. Then angrily defending himself, "You did it yourself, you ape. I was trying to get rid of the knife when you jumped me." But I knew that, and he knew I knew it. He turned and scooped up Rindy, who was sobbing noisily. She dug her head into his shoulder, and I made out her strangled words. "The other toys hurt you when I was mad at you," she sobbed, rubbing her fists against smeared cheeks. I wasn't that mad at you. I wasn't that mad at anybody. Not even him." Rakhal pressed his hand against his daughter's fleecy hair and said, looking at me over her head, "The toys activate a child's subconscious resentments against his parents. I found out that much. That also means a child can control them for a few seconds. No adult can." A stranger would have seen no change in his expression, but I knew him and saw. "Julie said you threatened Rindy." He chuckled and set the child on her feet. "What else could I say that would have scared Julie enough to send her running to you? Julie's proud, almost as proud as you are, you stiff-necked son of the ape." The insult did not sting me now. "Come on, sit down and let's decide what to do, now we've finished up the old business." He looked remotely at Maylin and said, "You must be Dallisa's sister. I don't suppose your talents include knowing how to make coffee?" They didn't, but with Rindy's help, Maylin managed. And while they were out of the room, Rakhal explained briefly. "Rindy has rudimentary ESP. I've never had it myself, but I could teach her something, well, not much, about how to use it. I've been on Everin's track ever since that business of the Liss. I'd have got it sooner if you were still working with me, but I couldn't do anything as a Terran agent, and I had to be kicked out so thoroughly that the others wouldn't be afraid I was still working secretly for Terra. For a long time I was just chasing rumors, but when Rindy got big enough to look in the crystals of Nebran, I started making some progress. I was afraid to tell Julie. Her best safety was the fact that she didn't know anything. She's always been a stranger in the Dry Towns." He paused, then said with honest self-evaluation, "Since I left the Secret Service, I've been a stranger there myself." I asked, "What about Dallisa?" "Twins have some ESP to each other. I knew Maylin had gone to the toy maker. I tried to get Dallisa to find out where Maylin had gone, learn more about it. Dallisa wouldn't risk it. But Kiral saw me with Dallisa and thought it was Maylin. That put him on my tail too, and I had to leave Shainsar. I was afraid of Kiral," he added soberly, "afraid of what he'd do. I couldn't do anything without Rindy, and I knew if I told Julie what I was doing, she'd take Rindy away into the Terran zone, and I'd be as good as dead. As he talked, I began to realize how vast a web Evarin and the underground organization of Nebran had spread for us. Evarin was here today. What for? Rakhal laughed mirthlessly. He's been trying to get us to kill each other off. That would get rid of us both. He wants to turn over Wolf to the non-humans entirely. I think he's sincere enough, but... He spread his hands helplessly. I can't sit by and see it. I asked, point blank, are you working for Terra? Or for the Dry Towns? Or any of the anti-Terran movements? I'm working for me, he said with a shrug. I don't think much of the Terran Empire. But one planet can't fight a galaxy. Race, I want just one thing. I want the Dry Towns and the rest of Wolf to have a voice in their own government. Any planet which makes a substantial contribution to galactic science, by the laws of the Terran Empire, is automatically given the status of an independent commonwealth. If a man from the Dry Towns discovers something like a matter transmitter, Wolf gets dominion status. But Evarin and his gang want to keep it secret, keep it away from Terra, keep it locked up in places like Canarsa. Somebody has to get it away from them, and if I do it, I get a nice fat bonus and an official position. I believed that, where I would have suspected too much protestation of altruism. Rakhal tossed it aside. You've got Marion to take you through the transmitters. Go back to the Master Shrine and tell Evarin that Race Cargill is dead. In the Trade City they think I'm Cargill, and I can get in and out as I choose. Sorry if it caused you trouble, but it was the safest thing I could think of. And I'll advise Magnusson and have him send soldiers to guard the street shrines. Evarin might try to escape through one of them. I shook my head. Terra hasn't enough men on all Wolf to cover the street shrines in Sharin alone. And I can't go back with Marion. I explained. Rakhal pursed his lips and whistled when I described the fight in the transmitter. You have all the luck, Cargill. I've never been near enough even to be sure how they work. And I'll bet you didn't begin to understand. We'll have to do it the hard way then. It won't be the first time we've bulled our way through a tight place. We'll face Evarin in his own hideout. If Rindy's with us, we needn't worry. I was willing to let him assume command, but I protested. You take a child into that... What else can we do? Rindy can control the toys, and neither you nor I can do that if Evarin should decide to throw his whole arsenal at us. He called Rindy and spoke softly to her. She looked from her father to me, and back again to her father, then smiled and stretched out her hand to me. Before we ventured into the street, Rakhal scowled at the sprawled embroideries on Marion's robe. He said, in those things you show up like a snowfall in Shainsar. If you go out in them you could be mobbed. Hadn't you better get rid of them now? I can't, she protested. They're the keys to the transmitter. Rakhal looked at the conventionalized idols with curiosity, but said only, cover them up in the street then. Rindy, find her something to put over her dress. When we reached the street shrine, Marion admonished, stand close together on the stones. I'm not sure we can all make the jump at once, but we'll have to try. Rakhal picked up Rindy and hoisted her to his shoulder. Marion dropped the cloak she had draped over the pattern of the Nebran embroideries, and we crowded close together. The street swayed and vanished, and I felt the now familiar dip and swirl of blackness before the world straightened out again. Rindy was whimpering, dabbing smeary fists at her face. Daddy, my nose is bleeding. Marion hastily bent and wiped the blood from the snubby nose. Rakhal gestured impatiently. The workroom. Wreck everything you see. Rindy, if anything starts to come at us, you stop it. Stop it quick, and... He bent and took the little face between his hands. Chia, remember they're not toys, no matter how pretty they are. Her grave, grey eyes blinked, and she nodded. Rakhal flung open the door of the elves' workshop with a shout. The ringing of the anvils shattered into 1,000 dissonances as I kicked over a workbench, and half-finished toys crashed in confusion on the floor. The dwarfs scattered like rabbits before our assault of destruction. I smashed tools, filigree, jewels, stamping everything with my heavy boots. I shattered glass, caught up a hammer and smashed crystals. There was a wild exhilaration to it. A tiny doll, proportioned like a woman, dashed toward me, shrilling in her supersonic shriek. I put my foot on her and ground the life out of her, and she screamed like a living woman as she came apart. Her blue eyes rolled from her head and lay on the floor, watching me. I crushed the blue jewels under my heel. Rakhal swung a tiny hound by the tail. Its head shattered into debris of almost invisible gears and wheels. I caught up a chair and wrecked glass cabinet of parts with it, swinging furiously. A berserk madness of smashing and breaking had laid hold of me. I was drunk with crushing and shattering and ruining when I heard Malin scream a warning and turned to see Everin standing in the doorway. His green cat eyes blazed with rage. Then he raised both hands in a sudden sardonic gesture, and with a loping, inhuman glide, raced for the transmitter. "Rindy!" Rakhal panted. "Can you block the transmitter?" Instead, Rindy shrieked, "We've got to get out! The roof is falling down! The house is going to fall down on us! The roof! Look at the roof!" I looked up, transfixed by horror. I saw a wide rift open, saw the skylight shatter and break, and daylight pouring through the cracking walls. Rakhal snatched Rindy up, protecting her from the falling debris with his head and shoulders. I grabbed Malin round the waist, and we ran for the rift in the buckling wall. We shoved through just before the roof caved in and the walls collapsed, and we found ourselves standing on a bare grassy hillside, looking down in shock and horror, as below us section after section of what had been apparently bare hill and rock caved in and collapsed into dusty rubble. Malin screamed hoarsely, "Run! Run! Hurry!" I didn't understand, but I ran. I ran, my sides aching, blood streaming from the forgotten flesh wound in my side. Malin raced beside me, and Rakhal stumbled along, carrying Rindy. Then the shock of a great explosion rocked the ground, hurling me down full length, Malin falling on top of me. Rakhal went down on his knees. Rindy was crying loudly. When I could see straight again, I looked down at the hillside. There was nothing left of Everin's hideaway, or the master shrine of Nebran, except a great gaping hole, still oozing smoke and thick black dust. Malin said aloud, dazed, "So that's what he was going to do." It fitted the peculiar non-human logic of the Toymaker. He'd covered the traces. "Destroyed!" Rakhal raged. "All destroyed! The workrooms, the science of the toys, the matter transmitter. The minute we find it, it's destroyed." He beat his fists furiously. "Our one chance to learn." "We were lucky to get out alive," said Malin quietly. "Where on the planet are we, I wonder?" I looked down the hillside and stared in amazement. Spread out on the hillside below us lay the Khasa, topped by the white skyscraper of the HQ. "I'll be damned," I said. "Right here. We're home, Rakhal. You can go down and make your peace with the Terrans, and Julie. And you, Malin." Before the others, I could not say what I was thinking, but I put my hand on her shoulder and kept it there. She smiled, shakily, with a hint of her old mischief. "I can't go into the Terran zone looking like this, can I? Give me that comb again. Rakhal, give me your shirt cloak, my robes are torn." "You vain, stupid female, worrying about a thing like that at a time like this." Rakhal's look was like murder. I put my comb in her hand, then suddenly saw something in the symbols across her breasts. Before this I had seen only the conventionalized and intricate glyph of the toad god, but now... I reached out and ripped the cloth away. "Cargill!" she protested angrily, crimsoning, covering her bare breasts with both hands. "Is this the place? And before a child, too!" I hardly heard. "Look!" I exclaimed. "Rakhal, look at the symbols embroidered into the glyph of the god. You can read the old non-human glyphs. You did it in the city of the Lys. Malin said they were the key to the transmitters. I'll bet the formula is written out there for anyone to read. Anyone, that is, who can read it. I can't, but I'll bet the formula equations for the transmitters are carved on every toad god glyph on Wolf. Rakhal, it makes sense. There are two ways of hiding something. Either keep it locked away, or hide it right out in plain sight. Whoever bothers even to look at a conventionalized toad god? There are so many billions of them." He bent his head over the embroideries, and when he looked up, his face was flushed. "I believe, by the chains of Shara, I believe you have it, Race. It may take years to work out the glyphs, but I'll do it or die trying." His scarred and hideous face looked almost handsome in exultation, and I grinned at him. "If Julie leaves enough of you, once she finds out how you maneuvered her." "Look, Rindy's fallen asleep on the grass there. Poor kid. We'd better get her down to her mother." "Right." Rakhal thrust the precious embroidery into his shirt cloak, then cradled his sleeping daughter in his arms. I watched him with a curious emotion I could not identify. It seemed to pinpoint some great change, either in Rakhal or myself. It's not difficult to visualize one's sister with children, but there was some strange incongruity in the sight of Rakhal carrying the little girl, carefully tucking her up in a fold of his cloak to keep the sharp breeze off her face. Maylin was limping in her thin sandals, and she shivered. I asked, "Cold?" "No, but I don't believe Evarin is dead. I'm afraid he got away." For a minute the thought dimmed the luster of the morning. Then I shrugged. He's probably buried in that big hole up there. But I knew I would never be sure. We walked abreast, my arm round the weary, stumbling woman, and Rakhal said softly at last, "Like old times." It wasn't old times, I knew. He would know it too, once his exultation sobered. I had outgrown my love for intrigue, and I had the feeling this was Rakhal's last adventure. It was going to take him, as he said, years to work out the equations for the transmitter. And I had a feeling my own solid, ordinary desk was going to look good to me in the morning. But I knew now that I'd never run away from Wolf again. It was my own beloved sun that was rising. My sister was waiting for me down below, and I was bringing back her child. My best friend was walking at my side. What more could a man want? If the memory of dark, poisonberry eyes was to haunt me in nightmares, they did not come into the waking world. I looked at Maylin, took her slender, unmanacled hand in mine, and smiled as we walked through the gates of the city. Now, after all my years on Wolf, I understood the desire to keep their women under lock and key that was its ancient custom. I vowed to myself as we went that I would waste no time finding a fetter shop and having forged therein the perfect steel chains that should bind my love's wrists to my key forever. End of chapter 15. End of The Door Through Space by Marion Zimmer Bradley.